מכריזים לזאת. Welcome again to yet another episode of the video series of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS. Today we will be talking to Brigadier General Amir Avivi, who is the founder and CEO of a very interesting organization. It's called in Hebrew Habithonistim, and in English the Israel Defense and Security Forum, which is comprised of an impressive number of former IDF officers and security officials to address critical issues on the national security agenda. And it does so in a way very different from other organizations composed of IDF commanders and security officials, which have traditionally adopted a dovish concessionary approach. Before diving into our conversation, let me say that I hope that this interview will be just the first chapter in an ongoing series of cooperation and collaboration between Habithonistim, the Israel Defense and Security Forum, and IISS, the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies, which are two organizations that are largely like-minded on important issues on the national agenda. General Avivi, welcome. And thank you for making your home in the beautiful coastal community of Caesarea available for our exchange.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, Martin. Thanks.
Perhaps you can give the viewers briefly some idea of your activities before you decided to initiate the organization Habithonistim, the Israel Defense and Security Forum. What basically prompted you to spark this initiative?
Well, Martin, I come from a family that has been living in Jerusalem for 15 generations. I spent most of my young life outside of Israel. My father was a prominent diplomat, and I lived 5 years in Italy. I lived in South America, in Ivory Coast. So I got a sense of what it is to be a Jew in the diaspora. I came back to Israel at the age of 18, and I joined the military. I joined the combat engineers. I spent the next 30 years of my life fighting to defend the state of Israel in Judea and Samaria, in Gaza, in Lebanon. And after I was a battalion commander in Operation Defensive Shield, I was appointed aide-de-camp of the chief of the general staff. And there, from first hand, I saw the decision-making regarding the disengagement in Gaza. I saw a prime minister deciding against all advisors, against the advice of the chief of staff to disengage, although the chief of staff and the head of Shabak told him that this is going to be a disaster, that Hamas is going to take over in a year. But he took the decision, and I was there, at that moment in that meeting. And later on, when my commander, Bogi, the chief of staff, was fired and Chalutz replaced him.
Bogi, you mean Moshe Ya'alon, right?
Moshe Ya'alon, yeah, Lieutenant General, yeah.
The prime minister then was Ariel Sharon?
Exactly. And not only I saw a prime minister taking a decision against the defense establishment, I saw also the defense establishment changing its position within a month, saying, after they said clearly it's going to be Hamas land, with the change of chief of staff, I saw the defense establishment saying, no, it's not going to be Hamas, it's going to be Singapore.
This is very disturbing, of course.
Of course it's disturbing. I mean, you expect the defense establishment to be professional, to say exactly what will happen, not adopt ideas of politicians. And I also saw on the level of, the citizens, I saw a group of former generals adopting ideas which have nothing to do with the real situation, and saying that disengagement from Gaza will bring peace, that, this indeed will be some kind of Singapore. And this was disturbing, and I felt that if this decision-making is going to happen in Judea and Samaria, there is a very strong chance that we won't have a state. So I felt that there is a need for a very, very dominant organization that will promote Israel's national security in the long term for generations to come.
I think that's an excellent initiative, and if I just might add, I think perhaps even more disturbing than what you've just said, that Arik Sharon himself wrote an article in 1992 predicting exactly what will happen if we leave Gaza, and despite his own predictions, he pushed forward with the evacuation and the abandonment of Gaza.
Yes, and today we see we are not only under the umbrella of tens of thousands of rockets from Gaza. Gaza is also affecting the whole area. They are affecting the Bedouins in the Negev. They are affecting what is happening in the mixed cities. They are affecting Judea and Samaria, destabilizing all over the land of Israel. And this is what happens when bad decisions are taken and there is no organization that can say to the public and decision makers that this is wrong.
Okay, so you've more or less answered my next question, which I was going to ask you, sort of what prompted you to set up the organization. But what is the operating rationale for Habithonistim, the Israel Defense and Security Forum, and where do you see it going?
Well, you know, first of all, we started 2 years ago. We just started organizing. You know, I phoned a few generals and said, listen, guys, we need something different. We started organizing, and maybe 2 weeks later, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who was the Prime Minister at the time, announced that he wants to apply sovereignty to Jordan Valley. Now, we thought that this is a huge importance strategically for Israel. You know, Israel cannot thrive without the Jordan Valley. So we drafted a letter and prepared the logo, the same one until today, and sent the Prime Minister a letter saying that the Habithonistim movement, Israel Defense and Security Forum, calls to apply sovereignty to Jordan Valley. We supported that against other groups that were saying otherwise. And once this was published, I started getting hundreds of phone calls of officers all over Israel asking, what's going on? What is this organization? We want to join. So we started with WhatsApp groups, and within 2 weeks, we were 300 officers. Now we are more than 3,000. So this, you know, can give you an understanding of how much traction the organization is having in Israel.
I think you filled an important vacuum in Israel's political landscape, because up until now, that space has been occupied mainly, as I said before, by dovish concessionary commanders who've been pushing for political appeasement and territorial withdrawal. So I think you filled an important breach in the landscape here. So where do you see this going? What are your goals?
Well, we feel, first of all, that there is a huge problem with our basic values. I mean, the values of Judaism and Zionism are in retreat. We see it in Israel, we see it in the Jewish world as well. And while the world is promoting a strong narrative saying that Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, nobody is talking anymore about Judea and Samaria, nobody is talking about two states. They are talking about the complete annihilation of the state of Israel. They are talking about the fact that Jews don't have a right to be in the land of Israel at all. And this is a big danger now. It's not only talking. When we are looking at what is going on inside the borders of the land of Israel, there is a whole campaign led by Hamas, by the Palestinian Authority, and joined by groups of Israeli Arabs, trying to undermine Zionism everywhere, grabbing the land, in Judea and Samaria, in the Negev, in the Galil, in the mixed cities, destabilizing the personal security of the Jewish people everywhere. And outside Israel, we see the Iranian regime building a huge force of hundreds of thousands of rockets and missiles. So these two vectors are moving fast, and at a certain stage they might meet, and we might face ourselves with a real existential threat. And people are not aware of the situation, how grave it is. So there is a need for a very, very dominant organization like us to make sure that we can shape the public's understanding, but also the decision makers. So we are operating today on the education level, educating the young generation in the pre-army programs, reaching out to Jewish communities, and starting to educate also the young generation of the Jewish communities around the world. We are very active on social media and media, so we can reach as much audiences as we can. And we have a very strong department of research that enables us to write papers for decision makers, both in Israel and outside Israel.
Let me ask you the question, why is it that up until your organization came on stream, nearly all the other organizations which involved high-ranking ex-IDF officers all endorsed a concessionary policy of political appeasement and territorial withdrawal? Because, you know, I've read through their plans, and I don't see anything there that draws on their professional expertise. If you look at the military factors like strategic depth, the length of the borders, topographical superiority, internal lines, these will all be sacrificed by territorial withdrawal. And so, you know, it seems to cut against military doctrine, military imperatives. So how do you explain this stance of these ex-officers, many of them generals, even chiefs of staff, heads of security organizations? Why do they adopt this position?
Well, I'm not sure I have the answer to say why they think like that. I can say that when you look into details about this organization, you will see that most of them are around 75, 80 years old. These are generals that fought in the Yom Kippur War. They build their life, you know, thinking in a different way. And it seems to me like they're tired from fighting for the land of Israel. They are looking for easy solutions. And there are no easy solutions in Israel. And we are the younger generation. We had to deal with their decision-making regarding Oslo and what happened later on. We had to fight in Judea and Samaria and in Gaza and in Lebanon. And I think my generation, which is a generation younger, is much, much more connected to the core values of Zionism, much more connected to what's going on the ground and understanding the threats. We are not against solutions and peace. We actually promote quite a few out-of-the-box ideas, but we are not willing to give up the basic profession and understanding what are Israel's national security needs, and we're not willing to take any risks that are, you know, will endanger the state of Israel. So this is why we're promoting a very, very clear vision of what Israel needs in order to exist and thrive in the long term.
So we're probably getting towards the end of our interview, but if you were to list what you would see as the major threats, because you talked about almost as a perfect storm building up against Israel, what would you say the major threats are, and how do they combine?
Okay. First of all, the most basic threat we have, it's not our enemies, it's us. It's us not connecting to our values. The most basic things Israelis and Jews need to do is connect back to their basic values of Judaism and Zionism. And remember that we are the good guys, we are the heroes, we are the ones who came back after 2,000 years. We were expelled from our land, and we came back. This is Zionism. And people forgot what it is all about, okay?
The Zionist narrative is certainly a very stirring story.
Yeah, indeed. And this is what many people in the world and also the Arabs inside Israel are trying to erase. Our basic sense of connection to our land. And you can be deeply, deeply connected to your land and yet seek for solutions. It's not one way or the other. You don't need to disconnect from your values in order to seek solutions. And this is what we are talking about, especially with the young generation. The other thing is understanding geography. As you said, Israel, at the end of the day, is a state that from the sea to the Jordan River, it's 45 miles. That's it. You know, I drove in Miami. I had a meeting. I drove maybe a quarter of Miami. I drove more than that. So it's a very, very small land. And most of it is Judea and Samaria. It's the mountains. You cannot live here. You cannot control this land without strong presence in the mountains. So basically, Israel, in order to exist, needs the Jordan Valley in its most broadest sense, which means also the mountains, in order to prevent any attack from the Middle East into Israel. And the other thing is that you need full security control in Judea and Samaria. You cannot have full security control without massive presence of towns. Does it mean that there are no solutions for the Palestinians who live in Judea and Samaria? There are solutions, many solutions. You can find a solution, just as the former administration in the United States tries to push forward, something similar to what Rabin wanted. But first and foremost, we, the Jewish people, need to understand exactly what we need to thrive, because this is the most important thing. We have only one state.
How about domestic threats apart from the loss of values? Do you see any other domestic threats in Israel?
Well, definitely we see today, especially it's very clear after the last operation when we saw the uprisal of Israeli Arabs against Jews in the mixed cities, in Jerusalem, in the Galil. We see what is happening in the Negev. We understand that really we like to, divide, say this is Hamas, this is the Palestinian Authority, here are Israeli Arabs. But the reality of the matter is that this is one campaign all over the land of Israel. And therefore, all these discussions we Jews are having are irrelevant. Because the BDS, the world is talking about Palestine from the river to the sea. The Arabs are attacking us all over the place. And we need to understand that if we don't go back to the one simple medicine for all this mess, it's called Zionism. It's very simple. Going back to our core values, willingness to fight for our country, and the more willing we are, the stronger we are, the more chances are that there will be peace and quiet. When they see weakness, by the way, just as in the global arena, when the US shows weakness, we see that this brings wars. We see now Russia on the Ukrainian border. We see the Iranians not afraid to challenge the free world and challenge the Middle East and Israel. This is a tough world which requires strong values and requires a strong army and strong police. So this is what we are talking about.
So, in conclusion, let me sum up this fascinating interview by adopting the dictum that you just used. Zionism is the answer.